A film that millions of people quote, rewatch, and tie to their own childhood came within 2 days of never being shot at all. On screen, it looks effortless. 4 boys walking a railroad line toward the body of a missing kid through one last summer before everything about them changes. Behind it sits a production that nearly fell apart twice, a director who manipulated his young cast to draw the performances he wanted out of them, and a man-made pond left to rot on purpose. It began with a quiet book by a writer the world knew only for frightening people. Number 1. It started as a tale called The Body. For a writer the world knew best for haunted hotels and a rabid dog, the source here had no monster in it at all. Stephen King published the novella The Body in 1982, tucked inside a collection called Different Seasons, the same volume that would later hand Hollywood The Shawshank Redemption and Apt Pupil. 3 of its 4 stories eventually became films, which tells you how much ordinary life King had folded into a book most readers picked up expecting to be scared. What set this one apart in his catalog was how close to the bone it sat. He reached back into his own boyhood in Maine to write it, building the whole thing out of the friendships, the dares, and the small cruelties he had actually lived through. The result is one of the most personal things he ever set down on a page. The path from book to screen opened with producer Bruce A. Evans, who read the story, fell hard for it, and optioned it, locking up the rights for somewhere around $50,000. It was a modest price for material nobody yet saw as commercial, a quiet coming-of-age piece with no easy hook a studio could put on a poster. Everything the film would eventually become was already there in the prose, in the voice of a grown man looking back at the summer that shaped him. What the story still lacked was a filmmaker who understood that the walk down the tracks mattered far more than whatever waited at the end of them, and that the body itself was almost beside the point. Number 2. The director who chose 9.5 weeks instead. Before a gentle story about 12-year-olds found the right hands, it nearly went to a filmmaker known for glossy, grown-up heat. Adrian Lyne, who had already made Flashdance and would soon make Fatal Attraction, was the first name attached to the project. On paper, it was a strange pairing. A director drawn to sleek adult sensuality handed a tender tale about boys and a dead body out in the woods. In the end, he turned it down, tied up on the production of 9.5 weeks and unable to begin work until the spring of 1986. He went where his schedule and his instincts already pointed, and the door swung open behind him. Lyne would carry on building a career out of provocative adult dramas, about as far from a campfire and a railroad track as a filmmaker could get. That scheduling clash is the hinge the whole film turns on. With Lyne gone, the work passed to Rob Reiner, newly arrived from the mock documentary This Is Spinal Tap and hunting for something with more heart in it than a spoof. He had only a couple of comedies to his name at that point, and nothing yet that hinted he could handle this kind of tenderness. What Reiner brought was an instinct for warmth and for the ache hiding under all that boyhood bravado. He grasped that the heart of the story was the company itself. 4 kids in the last summer, before the world pulled them apart. The man who would set the tone of every single frame got the job almost by accident, because someone else's calendar happened to be full. Number 3. From the Body to Stand By Me. Columbia took one look at the working title and balked. To studio ears, the old name sounded like a slasher picture, a bodybuilding flick, or something seedier still, anything but the tender story it actually was. Executives worried that people would buy a ticket expecting one kind of movie and walk straight into another, and the fear was not unreasonable given how a single blunt word can prime an audience before the lights even go down. Reiner offered a replacement borrowed from the Ben E. King song he had already chosen to close the film, and even that won less on enthusiasm than on being the least disliked option anyone at the table had floated. Nobody loved it, nobody hated it either, and that was enough. The new name arrived in March of 1986, only weeks ahead of release, which is awfully late to settle on what to call a movie. For a stretch there, the film's whole identity was resting on a song that had not even been locked into the soundtrack yet. Number 4. Rebuilt around one lonely boy. Reiner's first instinct about the script was that it had no center to hold on to. King's novella had spread its weight fairly evenly across all 4 kids, giving each of them roughly equal room. And on the page that balance worked fine. As a film, it felt unfocused to Reiner, a string of episodes with no spine running through them. He has said the early draft left him cold, and he knew exactly why. So he made the single most important creative decision of the whole production. He pulled the story tight around one character, Gordy, the watchful one, the boy whose father plainly preferred a dead older brother and who would grow up to become a writer. That grown writer, of course, is essentially King himself, looking back down the years. Once the film had Gordy at its emotional heart, everything else settled into place around him. The change rippled outward into every scene, into the narration and the framing and the way the other three boys orbit Gordy rather than sharing the spotlight with him. The search for the body stopped being the point of the journey and became its backdrop, a frame for a story about a kid working out, scene by scene, the kind of man he was going to be. One structural rethink turned a boyhood adventure into something far closer to a meditation on memory and growing up, and that is a large part of why the film still aches the way it does almost 40 years on. Number 5. 300 Boys, Then These Four. The audition rooms ran for months, one nervous kid after another stepping up to read the same handful of scenes. Roughly 300 young actors passed through the process before the four leads were finally settled, and the list of names who came close is staggering in hindsight. Ethan Hawke, Sean Astin, and Stephen Dorff all read for parts, each of them already on his way to a career of his own. Any one of them might have ended up walking those rails instead, in a version of the film nobody will ever get to see. The hunt was exhaustive, the kind of months-long search where the same handful of scenes gets read hundreds of different ways before the right four faces finally walk through the door. There were near misses on the other side of the ledger too. Corey Haim was offered the part of Chris Chambers and turned it down to make Lucas instead, a decision that handed one of the decade's defining roles to River Phoenix. Once the foursome was locked, the boys threw themselves into building their characters with a care that ran well past their years. Phoenix decided, entirely on his own, that Chris was a year older than the others and had been held back a grade at some point, a small, invented piece of backstory he carried into every scene without ever once spelling it out for the audience. That kind of unprompted detail is the sort of thing seasoned adult actors are praised for, and here it was coming from a kid. What gives the casting story its weight is how close the whole thing came to a very different shape. The chemistry audiences have treasured for decades had to be assembled by hand, one lucky decision at a time, out of hundreds of hopeful kids and a small handful of right calls. Even so, not every choice on the production would go as smoothly as those four boys eventually did. Number 6. The wrong man is still in the Jeep. Freeze the very first shot of the grown narrator and look closely at the figure behind the wheel because the actor sitting there never finished the role. David Dukes was originally cast as the adult writer, the older Gordy who bookends the whole film, and he even shot his scenes. Michael McKean had read for the same part somewhere along the way. Then, fairly late in the process, Reiner changed his mind about who should carry those closing moments. He turned to Richard Dreyfuss, a friend he had known since the two of them were 15 years old, and reshot the writer's material with him. Dreyfuss was a major star and an Oscar winner by 1986, and his presence lent the framing device a quiet weight, on top of a friendship that made the late switch an easy call. The reshoots covered the bookends, the older writer at his desk and out behind the wheel, almost everything that part of the film needed. Almost. One early shot of the writer sitting in his vehicle was never redone, so for a few seconds right at the start of the film, the actor framed on screen is David Dukes, left over from the original version. Most people have watched those opening minutes 100 times without ever once catching it. It is a true continuity artifact hiding in plain sight, a small seam where one version of the movie shows through another, and the kind of thing that, once somebody points it out to you, you can never quite manage to unsee. Number 7. A week of games before a frame rolled. In a hotel suite in Oregon in June of 1985, the four boys spent their days deep in improvisation, with no camera anywhere in sight. Reiner had gathered them a full week ahead of the shoot, working from Viola Spolin's Improvisations for the Theater, a well-known handbook of theater games, and none of it had a thing to do with the script. The exercises never touched the actual scenes. What they were building instead was trust, the loose, instinctive ease of friendship that no amount of rehearsal can fake once the cameras start rolling. The writers and a few of the crew wandered in to take part from time to time. By the time the shoot finally began, the bond the entire film leans on was already there, formed on purpose and in private. Years afterward, the cast still pointed back to that week as the thing that made all the rest possible. They had walked in as strangers on a Monday and walked out as something close to a gang by Friday, which is exactly why none of it ever once looks like acting. Number 8. Maine quietly turned into Oregon. The fictional town of Castle Rock was built for the cameras around the actual community of Brownsville, a long way from where the story had first been imagined. King had set everything down in his home state, but the production lifted the whole thing and moved it west, even nudging the calendar back a year, from 1960 to 1959, for the particular flavor of summer it wanted on screen. The locations read like a tour of small-town Oregon: Brownsville, Eugene, Veneta, Cottage Grove, and Junction City. What is striking is that nearly all of those places are still standing today, more or less as they looked back then, which means a devoted fan can walk a good deal of the film in person. That grounding in an actual place is rare for a story built so heavily on memory and mood, and it is part of why the picture's nostalgic Americana feels so specific. The town the boys moved through was a living one, dressed up for the era, but never invented out of nothing. Number 9. Saved 2 days before by one check. With the cameras almost ready to roll, the money for the entire production simply vanished. Embassy, the company backing the film, had just been sold to Columbia, by then owned by Coca-Cola. The new bosses took one look at the project and decided it was not commercial enough to be worth the gamble. They pulled the funding roughly 2 days before shooting was due to begin. A finished script, a full cast, a whole crew, every location scouted and ready to go, then suddenly nothing left to point a camera with. Everyone was already gathered out in Oregon, the clock running, the budget gone overnight. The timing could hardly have been crueler, with the sets dressed and the boys ready, and the whole machine poised to start the moment the plug came out of the wall. What saved the film was a single act of faith out of one man's own bank account. Norman Lear, who had given Reiner his start years earlier in television and was a co-owner of Embassy, stepped in and personally put up around $8 million to keep it alive. Sit with that figure for a second. This was one man writing a personal check for the cost of an entire movie, with no slate of other pictures to spread the risk across, on nothing firmer than his belief in the director. He did it because he trusted Reiner, plainly and simply, and because he refused to let the film fall apart with the company that had abandoned it. Reiner has spoken since about what that gesture meant to him, a vote of confidence with real money behind it at the precise moment everyone else had walked away. It is a rare thing in Hollywood for a mogul to fund a movie out of his own pocket, and rarer still on the strength of one person. 2 days from collapse, the whole thing survived on a single man's conviction alone. Number 10. Walking Buster Keaton's old tracks. East of Cottage Grove ran a stretch of the old Oregon Pacific and Eastern Rail Line, and that is where the crew filmed a good deal of the boys' long trek along the rails. That same steel carried a surprisingly deep cinematic history. 60 years earlier, back in 1926, Buster Keaton had shot his silent masterpiece, The General, on those very rails, performing his own hair-raising stunts along the line, including the famous sequence with a locomotive crashing through a burning bridge. Two landmark American films, made 6 full decades apart, share one modest stretch of Oregon country. The wider area had long-drawn productions hunting for unspoiled land and honest working track, far from the look of a studio backlot. Whether any of the 4 boys knew, as they walked, that they were retracing the footsteps of one of the great silent clowns is anyone's guess. Either way, the lineage is there, and film history buffs treasure it. Number 11. The finished film no one would touch. Surviving the funding collapse turned out to be only half the battle. The movie got made, but once Embassy was sold off, it suddenly found itself with no distributor at all, a fully finished picture, and nowhere on earth to show it. That is a strange and dangerous place for a film to land. A movie nobody will release does not sit in limbo gracefully. It gathers dust and gets forgotten. Paramount, Universal, and Warner Brothers each took a look and passed. 3 major studios stared at a film now treasured as an American classic and somehow saw nothing in it worth buying. The producers leaned on Michael Ovitz, the most powerful agent in town over at CAA, to help shop it around to anyone who would listen. The thing that finally broke the logjam was almost comically small. Columbia's head of production took a copy home with him while he was out sick in bed, put it on to pass the time, and watched his own daughters fall completely for it. Their reaction was instant and total, the kind no test screening can manufacture. Their enthusiasm did what a whole roomful of executives could not. It is a strange footnote for a film this beloved, that its survival came down to one tired executive's living room and the unguarded taste of 2 kids. A future classic, already shot, edited, and ready to go, came within a hair of never reaching a single theater, rescued in the end by a couple of kids on a sick day. Number 12. The train was farther than it looked. On screen, the boys looked to be mere inches from being run down by tons of oncoming steel, in the most heart-stopping moment the whole film has to offer. The reality out on the set was far calmer than that. The shot relied on a telephoto lens, which flattens distance and compresses space, making the engine appear right on the kids' heels, when in fact it sat a long way back down the line. The terror was an optical illusion, built carefully frame by frame, an old trick of perspective doing the work that danger seems to be doing. A few other details fill the scene out. For certain pieces of the sequence, female stunt doubles with their hair cropped short stood in for the young actors, slipping into the frame for the riskier beats so the boys never had to be anywhere near the track at speed. This was also the only part of the entire production shot in California, filmed near the town of Boerne rather than up in Oregon with everything else. The compression is so convincing that even people who know the trick still flinch at the shot, which is the mark of a sequence built with patience and a good lens. At no point in any of it were the boys ever in actual danger. The single moment that makes whole audiences hold their breath was, in plain and slightly deflating fact, one of the safest things the crew put together all summer. Number 13. The kids swearing earned an R. A tender coming-of-age story about 4 12-year-olds somehow walked away with the same restricted rating as a hard adult thriller. The reason came down almost entirely to the language. The boys talked the way kids that age actually talked among themselves when no adults were around, an unbroken stream of rough, salty backtalk the censors could not see past. Reiner and King had both dug in hard on this point, choosing honest playground dialogue over anything sanded down for comfort, on the belief that the texture of how kids really speak was worth the rating. That insistence is a big part of why the film still rings so true decades later. Kids who grew up exactly like these ones heard their own conversations coming back at them off the screen, every blunt insult and dare and half-understood swear. Parents who wanted to share it with their own 12-year-olds, meanwhile, often found themselves stuck at the rating, locked out of showing it to the very age group it was about. The irony sits right out in the open, a beloved story about the inner life of childhood, made effectively off-limits to the children it portrays so well. Whether that was a fair trade in the end depends entirely on what you believe a film like this is really for. It remains one of the more unusual ratings of the decade, a wholesome-looking picture handed a hard label for the crime of sounding too much like actual childhood. Number 14. Those cigarettes were just cabbage. Watch the boys light up at various points across the film, and you might wince a little at the sight of kids smoking, right up until you learn what was actually rolled inside. At Reiner's firm insistence, the props were made from cabbage leaves instead of tobacco. On camera, the cabbage smoldered and curled smoke much like the genuine article, enough to sell the 1950s authenticity without putting anything harmful anywhere near a child's lungs. The boys looked every inch the small-town kids they were playing. The period detail held up, and not one young actor was ever handed something he should not have had. The fix cost the production almost nothing and solved a thorny problem in a single clean stroke. It is exactly the sort of small practical trick that slips right past an audience without leaving a trace. Most people who have loved this film for the better part of 40 years have no idea the smokes were vegetables the entire time. Number 15. A swamp left to rot for weeks. The crew dug a pond by hand, lined it carefully with a hidden tarp, and then did the one thing absolutely guaranteed to spoil it: nothing at all. They let it sit. Through much of the long, baking Oregon summer, that man-made pool stayed untouched in the heat while the rest of the production carried on around it. By the time the leech scene finally came up on the schedule, the water inside had turned slimy, stagnant, and foul, a thick stew of sun and stillness that no special effect of the era could have come close to matching. The realism you see on screen works as well as it does precisely because almost none of it was faked. It was wrought, grown on purpose, scheduled in advance like any other piece of the shoot, and the actors had to wade into it for the cameras. Whatever discomfort shows on their faces did not need much coaxing. The scene itself reaches all the way back into Stephen King's own childhood. The leech ordeal is something the author actually lived through as a boy in Maine, right down to the infamous and unfortunate detail of one of them ending up in a rather private and unmentionable spot. That single mortifying memory, awful in the moment and unshakable ever after, found its way decades later onto the screen as one of the most squirm-inducing sequences in the whole movie. So much of this story was built straight out of things that happened to one real kid, and The Swamp is one more piece of that pattern. A true horror from a true summer, recreated by leaving a hole in the ground to fester until it was every bit as nasty as the page had always demanded. The grossest thing in the film, in other words, was not an effect anyone had to invent. King has never been shy about where his horror comes from, and a good deal of it, it turns out, comes from having been a boy near the water in Maine. Number 16. The campfire tears were all real. Of all the quiet moments the four boys share out there in the dark, the one where Chris finally comes apart over the stolen milk money cuts the deepest of any of them. The reason it works as well as it does is that the feeling running through it was not manufactured. Reiner sensed that River Phoenix had something deeper still in him for the scene, and rather than direct the boy line by line, he took him aside and gently asked him to think back to a time when a grown-up he had trusted let him down badly. Phoenix gave the take that ended up in the finished film, and it shook him so thoroughly that Reiner had to gather him up and steady him once the cameras stopped rolling. There is real weight in sitting with that for a second. The grief an audience feels watching that scene came from somewhere painfully honest. A 12-year-old boy reaching down into an old hurt, handing it over to the camera, and then needing to be held like the child he still was underneath it all. It is one thing to admire a performance like that, and another to remember it was a kid in there. You end up wondering what it costs a child to be that good and that young. Number 17. Ace tossed the Yankees cap away. When the chief bully snatches away the prized keepsake that once belonged to Gordy's late older brother, the easy, obvious move is to make the theft itself ache with meaning. Kiefer Sutherland's first instinct as Ace was to do exactly that. He went to pull the Yankees cap onto his own head, the way a person naturally might who actually wanted the thing for himself, who saw some value in holding it. Reiner stopped him right there. The cap matters enormously to Gordy, one of the few things he has left of a brother his father openly mourned far more than he ever valued his living son. The note he gave was sharp and clear. Ace takes the hat for one reason only, to be cruel, to wound a grieving kid where it will land hardest, and he throws it away the very moment it is in his hands. That is precisely why Gordy never gets his dead brother's cap back. The thing is gone, discarded in an instant by someone who never cared about it. The cruelty is the whole of the gesture, with nothing softer hiding underneath it, and it tells you exactly how the film understands a character like Ace. Sutherland and Will Wheaton both confirmed the choice in interviews years afterward. It is a tiny piece of direction, a few seconds of screen time at most, and it manages to define the movie's villain more sharply than any amount of dialogue could. Number 18. The knock Vern couldn't remember. Up in the boys' ramshackle treehouse sits a small, funny little beat where Vern blanks completely on the club's secret way in. He stands there fumbling at it, locked out by nothing more than his own terrible memory, while the others slowly lose patience with him. The thing is, that whole moment was never written into the script at all. The boys came up with it themselves on the day, improvising on the spot to make Vern just a touch more lovably hopeless than the page had already drawn him. It grew directly out of the same loose, real-life play between the four of them that no screenwriter could ever have put down on paper in advance. That is the quiet payoff of all that time spent building a bond before the cameras rolled. The chemistry got so easy that the boys could invent character beats together on the fly. A throwaway gag, dreamed up in the moment, and somehow one of the warmest little touches in the entire film. Number 19. One fat suit, 100 barfers. Brownsville's Pioneer Park filled up with local extras, each one handed a hidden pouch of blueberry filling and told to wait for a number to be called. This was the elaborate staging for the film's legendary pie-eating contest, the gleefully disgusting tall tale Gordy spins about a heavyset boy nicknamed Lard-Ass Hogan. Young actor Andy Lindbergh played the role inside a two-piece fat suit and a pair of size 60 Levi's, a getup built to transform a perfectly ordinary kid into the story's enormous put-upon hero. The gag itself was mass-cued chaos from start to finish. Roughly 100 extras packed into the park, and as their assigned numbers were called out one by one, each let loose a waiting mouthful of blueberry mush right on cue, setting off the rolling chain reaction the whole sequence depends on. The pies had been sitting out in the summer heat long enough to turn properly rancid, sticky, rotten, and ripe, which only fed the queasy effect the crew was after. an even messier version of the sequence reportedly worked in a vacuum cleaner gag before it was trimmed down. The entire spectacle was pulled off with practical tricks and a small army of cooperative locals, without one single frame of it faked by a computer. Townspeople who took part still talk about that day and about the smell, which reportedly hung over the park long after the cameras were packed away. For a set piece that looks like pure mayhem, it was choreographed down to the number. Number 20. Laced cookies shut it all down. For 2 full days, the whole production simply ground to a stop. The reason behind the shutdown has been told and retold so often over the years that it now lives somewhere in the haze between memory and legend. The version most people know comes from Kiefer Sutherland. As he has recounted it, one of the younger actors slipped away from a babysitter, wandered off to a nearby fair on his own, and ate some treats that, unknown to him, had been tampered with to contain something he never should have had. He was found hours later, woozy, tearful, and badly shaken. The shoot went dark for 2 days while he recovered. A name usually gets attached to the story and the retelling, but it is worth being plain about what this actually is. A cast anecdote, handed down and smoothed over with each new telling, rather than anything firmly documented anywhere. Whether it happened quite the way the legend now has it, or simply grew taller every time someone passed it along, is impossible to pin down at this distance. Stories like this one cling to productions full of children, where the line between mischief and serious trouble ran thinner than anyone would allow on a set today. What the story does capture, true in spirit if nothing else, is just how wild and unpredictable the off-screen lives of these particular boys could be, every bit as much as the characters they were busy playing on camera. Number 21. A fake town named a real studio. In 1987, riding high on the film's unexpected success, Reiner co-founded a production company and borrowed its title straight from the story itself. He called it Castle Rock Entertainment, after the invented little Oregon community the boys roam through in the film, the very same fictional town that had been built up for the cameras around Brownsville. The choice tied the brand new company to Stephen King's wider fictional world, where the name Castle Rock turns up again and again across his books as a recurring setting that links one story to the next. From that one small borrowed name grew a studio that would go on to make major films and television for decades to come, with a long run of hits and a few outright classics to its name. A throwaway fictional town, dreamed up for a novella about boys looking for a body, ended up as one of Hollywood's most recognizable banners. There is a neat circularity in that, a place that never existed, lending its name to a company that would go on to shape what millions of people actually watched. Number 22. An old song climbed back up the charts. 25 years is a very long time for any record to sit before suddenly finding a whole second life. Ben E. King had first released his single back in 1961, and there it might well have stayed forever, a fondly remembered oldie and nothing more. Then the film borrowed it to play over the closing credits, and the song came roaring straight back. It re-entered the Billboard Hot 100 in October of 1986 and climbed all the way to number 9 that December, a hit all over again more than 2 full decades after it first charted. There was very nearly a different voice on the recording altogether. Michael Jackson, at the absolute height of his fame, was actually approached about cutting a brand new cover for the film. Reiner thought it over and decided the original simply fit the picture better, so King's version stayed exactly where it was, which now seems like the only choice that could have worked. The soundtrack carried a whole rolling wave of late 50s and early 60s oldies alongside it. The album as a whole helped reignite a popular appetite for the music of that vanished era, sending a generation of listeners back to records their parents had grown up on. A single movie pushing a quarter-century-old song back up the national chart is the kind of cultural ripple that almost never gets to happen even once, let alone twice. It is a quiet measure of the film's pull that a recording nearly 30 years old could ride its coattails up the charts beside brand new releases. Number 23. Stephen King had to step outside. At an early test screening, the man whose story the whole thing had come from got up partway through the film and slipped out of the room. He was gone for a solid 15 minutes or so, and the obvious sinking fear among the people there was that something had gone badly wrong, that the author flat out hated what he was watching up on the screen. The truth turned out to be the complete reverse. Stephen King had been so deeply moved by the film that he needed a few minutes alone to pull himself back together before he could face going back inside. When he finally returned to his seat, he called it the first time one of his stories had ever been brought to the screen successfully. A remarkable thing for him to say, given how many adaptations of his work were already out there by then, plenty of them disappointments. He singled out one change in particular for praise: Reiner's decision to have Gordy, rather than Chris, be the one to pick up the gun near the end. King reportedly went so far as to wish he had thought of the idea himself. For an author whose books were so often flattened and lost in the move to film, that kind of full-throated blessing was a rare thing indeed, and it has been part of the film's legend ever since. The small change he singled out carried more weight than it looks. Handing the gun to Gordy, rather than Chris, shifted the whole moral center of the ending onto the boy the film had been built around. Number 24. The long shadow it cast on culture. Decades on from its release, the film refuses to stay in its own past, turning up again and again inside other people's work, quoted, borrowed, and lovingly parodied. John Singleton paid direct homage to it in Boys in the Hood, restaging its central imagery for a very different neighborhood and far harder, more dangerous stakes. Years after that, Stranger Things leaned on it so openly, with its pack of bikes, its small-town kids, and its thick haze of 80s childhood, that the debt it owes is impossible to miss for anyone who has seen both. Even The Simpsons got in on the act, with an episode titled The Blunder Years, in which Homer and his childhood friends head off to go looking for a dead body of their very own. The reason it gets reached for so constantly is that it more or less set the template in the first place. For an entire genre of coming-of-age stories, this is the benchmark every other film gets measured against, and it sits right near the dead center of how the whole 1980s are now remembered on screen. Few films get to define a genre and a decade at the same time, and fewer still keep getting rediscovered by audiences who were not even born when it first came out. The specific images are what stuck hardest: the long railroad walk, the campfire in the dark, and the particular ache of friendships that burn white-hot at 12 and then fade clean away by 20. That devotion spills right out into the world beyond the screen too. Brownsville, the small Oregon town that once stood in for Castle Rock, holds a celebration every year in the film's honor, complete with a single penny set into the street where a famous scene was shot and a dedicated visitor map that guides fans from one location to the next. Very few films of its modest size ever leave a footprint quite like that, woven at once into other movies, other television, and the actual yearly calendar of a living town. Number 25. The boys were playing themselves. It is easy enough to assume the four leads were simply talented young actors hitting their marks on command, right up until you notice how little space there was between the kids in front of the camera and the characters they had been cast as. Will Wheaton was, by most accounts, a shy and sensitive kid who got teased easily, which put him remarkably close to Gordy. Corey Feldman has said outright that Teddy, the most damaged and volatile of the four, was the character closest of all to his own difficult childhood. River Phoenix, for his part, tended to act as the group's protector off-camera, looking out for the others in almost exactly the way Chris looks out for the boys in the story. Wheaton has reflected in the years since on just how much private pain Feldman was carrying around back then, things the other kids only half understood at the time and have spent decades making sense of. The friendships audiences feel pouring off the screen were, in very large part, true, formed between four kids who each recognized something of themselves in the roles they had been handed and in one another. That overlap between the boys and their parts is a large reason the film never feels staged. The emotions were already close at hand, which meant the kids rarely had to reach for something they did not already know, which leaves hanging the one question the film has always circled back to, gently and without ever quite answering it. How much of what we feel watching these four is the acting, and how much of it was simply, plainly so? Nearly 40 years on, Stand By Me still holds its place because it puts a finger on something almost everyone carries: the fierce, short-lived friendships of childhood and the exact moment innocence starts to slip loose. For a film about how fragile all of that is, its own making was every bit as precarious, surviving a funding collapse 2 days from disaster and a cast that slowly turned into the very boys they were hired to play. If this walk back down the tracks stirred up a memory or two of your own, give the video a like and subscribe for more stories behind the films you grew up with. So here is the question I keep coming back to and want to leave with you. Who was the friend you had at 12 that you never quite found again?